Namaste, Bangalore. How you doing? Good, good. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I recognize that you've all been sitting there for almost 3 hours now, so I'd like to give you a small gift back. Why don't you all just stand up just for a second? Just stand up and just do a little stretch. I know it's going to feel a lot better. Can you balance on one foot? Balance on the other foot? Just get a bit of a stretch. Okay, thank you. I hope that helps. I hope that helps. Thank you again for joining us today. It's fantastic when our customers come and join us and let us know how they're using our products. And also, it's great to hear so many people that are interested in our products that are yet discovering all of the wonders that we have to offer with Amazon Web Services and cloud computing. Especially like to thank our customers. That was fantastic, the customer panel that came here and talked today. It's wonderful to hear their views and how they're actually experiencing massive cost savings and so on the cloud. So what I'm going to be talking about today, and I recognize it's the last talk before you all go to lunch, so I recognize that's quite an enviable position to be in. I'm going to try and drill down a little bit. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of how we can help you save money on your infrastructure costs. And I want to talk about it in the context of the total cost of ownership, which we like to call the total cost of non-ownership. How is it that you can leverage the cloud and all that we offer with AWS to achieve your IT needs without having to own any IT infrastructure? Now, it's not just the customers that are talking about Amazon Web Services. We're very lucky to have a lot of analysts rate us very highly, high and to the right in all those graphs. You recognize a lot of these names. And as recently as last year, in 2012, we were actually rated again high and to the right in terms of how we offer our infrastructure as a services offering compared to all the others. So bear that in mind when you evaluate Amazon Web Services as I'm talking today. Now, what I want to focus on is how we help to innovate, both on the cost side and other aspects of Amazon Web Services, but how Amazon is innovating their products continuously, but we're actually enabling customers of ours to innovate their products. You will recognize a lot of these company names and these logos, but most of these companies didn't even exist more than a few years ago. And it's arguable that a lot of them wouldn't have had the immense success that they've experienced, if they had to try and do the same job owning all the infrastructure required. Many of these brands have millions and millions of customers around the world, but lots of them have customers that they don't know when they're going to come and go from the platform. They didn't have an accurate prediction of who would join their platform. To give you some idea, let's take one example, Dropbox. Wave your hand if you use Dropbox. Isn't that a great service? Great product. Dropbox runs on Amazon Web Services. So they don't own any infrastructure that's required to store all the files that you put into Dropbox. When you put something in Dropbox, they simply pass it along to Amazon Web Services. Now think of how many millions of customers are using Dropbox, maybe just on the 2 GB free zone, or maybe they're paying more, but Dropbox didn't have an accurate estimate of how many customers would be joining their service. So they didn't lay out a whole bunch of money to acquire all the infrastructure required to store all that. So that's just one example of how these companies are achieving their needs with non-ownership. Now, that's not just the only use cases as these simple media, cool new companies. Just about every imaginable use case you can think of is now running on Amazon Web Services. And some of the bigger brand names there, Samsung, Shell, NASA, even as Dr. Vogels was talking about, very exciting to see how they're all leveraging Amazon Web Services in the cloud. Now, we're not saying that you have to learn any major new paradigms either. Sure, you can architect your systems differently, but you can use the same technology that you're familiar with. All those products on the right, on the partners that we have, the technology partners we have, are technologies that you're well familiar with. You've been using them for years. And we've worked very hard to partner with those companies to make sure that their technology is available to you on the cloud. On the left, you've got a whole bunch of partners that we've worked with to make sure that we can help you accelerate your move into the cloud. All these customers are training up on services and AWS to understand them, but if you need a little help, we've got lots of technology partners that can help you move into the cloud faster. Now, I want to take a step back at this point and just talk about the definition of cloud computing. Amazon Web Services has their own view of what cloud computing really means. And you will hear a lot of other companies talking about cloud computing in different contexts. So I want to just clear up what we think cloud computing means. And I'm going to focus on 4 points. The The first one is elasticity. The cloud is elastic both up and down. And let me clarify that make sure that you understand that very, very clearly. When you want to add infrastructure, it's very easy to go and buy some new hardware. And lots of vendors will sell you as much as they want, as much as you're prepared to pay for. But when you want to give it back, it's not quite as easy. What cloud computing with Amazon Web Services allows you to do is to shed that capacity. You can switch it off, stop using it, get rid of it at any time. So it's truly elastic, both in a gain perspective and a loss perspective. You can gain size of your infrastructure, capacity, and remove it as well when you don't need it. Now the second point, on demand, maybe you've misunderstood what we mean by that, because it's very important to us that you understand that you can get it when you want it right away. It's no good if you have to call your local sales guy, or you have to call your local vendor and say, I need 20 new servers, deliver it by 2 o'clock tomorrow. That's not going to happen. You need to have it on demand. And so we've exposed an API, an SDK. We have a management console that allows you to get that capacity when you need it right away. It's an instantaneous gratification system. You can get that capacity when you need it most, which is right now. The third aspect is what we'll focus on a bit more in this talk, is how much you have to pay for everything. It's all a pay-as-you-go model. And it's really, really critical that you understand that you can switch it off when you don't need it and immediately stop paying for it. There are no commitments, no long-term commitments. There's no minimum contract that you have to use to actually use the stuff to a certain level. You can use as little or as much as you want and as you need. And that's fantastic. I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail about how you can optimize that as well. Now, those first 3 points tie into the final one, which is your ability to focus on your business. And we've heard a lot of these customers on the panel, and you will know yourself that your business is not about IT infrastructure. That's our problem. Let us take that headache away from you. Let us do the dirty work while you can focus on making your customer experience better, enhancing your product, and delivering the true value that makes you unique. So let's dive into a few examples now. Let's say you were a company that wanted to store a whole bunch of data. Maybe it's files or picture files, PDFs, etc. And over a period of 3 years, you were estimating you were going to store about 50 terabytes of data, which is not unrealistic these days. Now, if you had a traditional system, you would be allocating the red line there to make sure that you always had more headroom or more capacity than you needed at any one time. So you would over-provision. Look at day one. You're already paying for a provisioned amount of storage, but you're only using a very, very little bit amount. Now, if you look at that over the months, what Amazon does is make sure that you only pay for the blue part. You're only paying for what you've actually stored in the system, not what you think you might need over time. And there's no requirement for you to provision ahead or tell us ahead, hey, I'm going to need another 10 terabytes next week or 20 terabytes the following week. So what we've done is we've eliminated the expense of all the red block there, because we think that's real waste. Why should you pay for something if you're not using it? The same applies to capacity. If you're running a web server, an application server, a database, that need will vary over time. There's no way that you're going to have exactly the same requirements all through the day, all through the night, year after year. So as that capacity requirement fluctuates, what traditionally companies have done is always allocate to your worst case scenario. That's the red line up there. That's what we call a high watermark. You're going to allocate enough capacity to make sure that when the peaks come, you can handle them. But think about all the waste between the red line and what you're actually using it. Let's drill down into a few more examples. If you have an on-off example, something that you run maybe periodically, once a month, once a year, once a season, you want to run that capacity, then switch it off and stop paying for it. But in traditional infrastructure, again, you'd have to allocate to the red line, which is right up top there, to make sure that you can handle all of your worst cases. The one in the bottom left is really interesting. If you have variable peaks, and a lot of us are experiencing this with websites, promotions, and so on, you don't know just how high those peaks will go, and you don't know how low the lows will go. So what happens here is that you have a difference between what you have and what you need, but what is worse is if you need more than you have. This is where you have customer dissatisfaction. There's nothing worse than having an uninterrupted, nothing worse than having an interrupted website where the application isn't available because you don't have enough capacity. None of your users want to open the mobile device and say, unavailable right now. So it all gets back to this light switch concept. Can you switch it off when you don't need it and stop paying for it? Here's another analogy I like to make. You get up in the morning, you get in the shower, and then you go to work. Who leaves the shower on all day? No one, right? You wouldn't waste water like that. That would be crazy. But that's exactly what so many companies have traditionally been doing. They start the company's infrastructure, they install a whole bunch of fancy servers, they wire it all together, it looks great, they switch it on, they use it a little bit, and then they walk away and don't use it as much as they think they need it to, so it's just running, wasting water, wasting electricity, wasting money. So think the whole time while I'm talking here about these examples, how can I switch my machines off? How can I reduce the cost? So with AWS, all you're going to do is follow exactly the curve. And you saw a great example from Dr. Vogel's with Amazon.com. I'll let the train go by. There it goes. So what you saw with Amazon.com was that given a certain period of time, we're able to switch off the capacity we don't need and save a huge amount of money. And you saw the percentage of savings, for instance, in November, where the spikes toward the end of the November is way different from the earlier ones. So again, following these curves, this applies to almost every one of these models. You can fluctuate your needs, you fluctuate your capacity, your storage, according to what you need at any one time. With predictable peaks, it's even better, because you know when the capacity is going to be required, you switch it on just when you need it, and you switch it off as soon as you don't need it. So this all gets back to the pay-as-you-go model. Are you paying too much by allocating resources that you don't need? If you only need one seat, pay for one seat. Don't pay for the whole bench. Now, a lot of you will be running in your head, well, we've already spent this much on infrastructure, or we want to spend this much on new servers or hardware. And what we're encouraging you to do is do a true apples-to-apples comparison. It's not fair to simply allocate a comparison between exactly what it would cost in AWS and the exact cost of just the hardware, because there's so many intangible and hidden costs involved in deploying your own IT infrastructure. Those of you that have worked in a company with its own data centers will know exactly what I'm talking about. Gartner has done an extensive amount of research on the networking, the cabling, air conditioning, floor space. What about people? These are all additional expenses that go hand in hand with the ownership of IT infrastructure. So what we want you to think about, what we're encouraging you to consider, is the total cost of non-ownership. How can I get rid of so many of these typical costs by not having to own the infrastructure? Just run through in your head an example of buying a whole bunch of new hardware. Typically, most companies would require you to investigate a number of vendors. You have to meet with those vendors. Maybe you have to go to lunch with all of them. Then you have to look at the specs of all their hardware. You have to make sure that there's a comparison between the different hardware specs that you need. Maybe you do a test, you do an evaluation. All of that is eliminated when you can just use cloud computing for exactly what you need, switch on AWS resources, and get started right away. Another big consideration here is the licensing of software. This has plagued companies for many, many years. Typically, a lot of these companies are acquiring multi-year licenses, and you know what I'm talking about. You know exactly how many licenses that they're asking you to buy, and you have to sign up for a very long-term contract or long-term license to have that. What we do is reduce that licensing down to a per-hour basis. So not only are you switching the hardware on and leaving it off when you don't need it, but the license associated with that instance, with that virtual machine in the cloud, is no longer paid for when you're not using it. So you don't have a bunch of unused licenses sitting around. You're literally only paying for what you're using. Much more efficient. So if you translate this from the upfront costs to the monthly costs, you'll realize that all the upfront costs that are typically associated with building your own IT infrastructure are largely eliminated when you move to the cloud. It's all translated to a very simple pay-as-you-go monthly fee. And that monthly fee will vary month to month depending on what your use is, so that your business can make moves up and moves down, and your cost structure will adjust accordingly. Now, we're going to move into some other intangibles over the course of this talk, where I'd make you think about not just the dollar amount of the actual instances, but the benefits that you derive in terms of cost from using cloud. If you own an infrastructure play, let's say a database system, you're going to have to take responsibility for building out the backup, the updates, the networking, the cabling, the interconnects, everything that goes associated with building that database system in your IT infrastructure on premises. What we're saying is that when you move into the cloud, you actually get a lot of the inherent benefits of some of those services that we've built, all built into it. So for instance, RDS, which is our relational database service, has multi-AZ. It means we can deploy the database across multiple data centers for you without you even having to worry about all that. Simply with one click, you can replicate the database to another availability zone and have both a master and a standby system up and running. So think about all the headache of researching how to do that, configuring the system, setting up a separate data center. All those benefits are derived simply by using the service. So that's, again, a huge cost saving that you might not take into account when you simply relate the cost of a database on premises and a database in the cloud. Those are additional savings there. Now, we're not saying that just moving something into the cloud automatically makes it infallible, fault tolerant. You've got to be designing carefully to take advantage of the way that the cloud is built. That's not to say you need to learn a whole bunch of new skills. You're using the same technology, but you're using it smart with the architecture that we recommend. And we've taken a lot of time, our solution architects, and some of it are upstairs, you can go and talk to them about this. We've deployed a whole bunch of architectures, reference architectures, that you can use as examples, blueprints of how to arrange your IT infrastructure in the cloud. And when you put it all together, these are really just building blocks. It's a whole bunch of services. We've got over 30 of them. You can take what you need, the bits and pieces that you require, put them together to build an architecture that can take advantage of the cloud's fault tolerance, can take advantage of the redundancy that we can offer, and make your system as reliable as possible. Because you see, every one of those building blocks, for instance, the instances, can be bought in a whole bunch of very different sizes, from micro to small to medium to quadruple, extra large, etc. In fact, this is a bit of a hard chart to read, but you'll see that we have dots, we have different instance types all across the board, on a range of memory sizes and a range of compute sizes. All different instances right to the specialist need that you require. But here's the really exciting part, and I get so excited about referencing this flexibility aspect of the cloud. Once you've chosen an instance, you can change your mind an hour later. There's no commitment to a particular instance type. You can literally change it to another instance type and try it out on a different size, whether it's bigger or smaller. You can revisit your architecture on an almost hourly basis to evaluate what's best for you. So it's not like walking into a store and buying a piece of hardware and then you're stuck with that size. You literally walk in, you buy a 2-seater car, you drive it around for a bit, you take it back an hour later and say you want a 4-seater car. Then you take it back a few hours later and take it back to a 2-seater car. You can adjust the size of the components as well as deciding whether to run them, switch them on and off. Now think about how much it costs to put all this infrastructure in place, and we're saving you the hassle of all of that by not owning it because you're just using it in the cloud. Let's take this a bit of a bigger step further now. Going global. You've heard this expression that we've used several times today. What's fantastic about this is that we have deployed the same architecture that I've been describing, all of our services, in a number of regions around the world. Let me go into a little bit of detail about how our global footprint looks, and you can see just to what advantage you can take advantage of this in using your own application and deploying it to the cloud. So we're going to start with the concept of regions. We have 9 regions worldwide, which are each made up of multiple availability zones. So when I joined Amazon, we just had a few. 3 years ago, we deployed the region in Singapore, a year later in Tokyo, and just last year, we deployed Sydney, Australia. So we're expanding rapidly. Now, each one of these regions is made up of multiple data centers. We call them availability zones. But within a region, the communication between the different zones is on very low latency, proprietary fiber that Amazon controls. So within a region, you can replicate your data from one AZ to the other very, very quickly. And that gives rise to the ability to do synchronous replication between 2 databases, one in AZ-A, one in AZ-B. It allows you to spread your application amongst 2 different availability zones. So if, in the rare event of one of those availability zones becoming unavailable or the building disappearing, your availability zone on the other side can take over. It can serve the application. Again, we're going to focus on trying to make your service, your web application, as uninterruptible as possible. So this is part of our fault-tolerant design or architecture. Now, in addition to all these availability zones around the world, we have 40 edge locations. And some of the talks later this afternoon in the solutions track will focus on exactly how these work. But it's basically our content distribution network deployed across the world, 40 edge locations that we can deploy your data, your static content, and your dynamic calls to the edge closer to the customer. And what this means for your customers, wherever they are in the world, they're going to get a better experience with their mobile device, better experience with their website, a better experience, lower latency, and so on, which enhances their experience and actually reduces your cost because you don't have to worry about putting this infrastructure in each one of the countries that it might be successful in. We don't know where our app's going to be most successful, and what's really exciting is there's an unprecedented ability now for everyone in this room. We're sitting in Bangalore, but I can deploy an application globally and address the global market. And that's really exciting to think that you have literally millions and billions of eyeballs that could be buying things from you, using your app, using your application. So I've talked now about the global infrastructure, which is the bottom line. Those are regions, availability zones, edge locations. On top of that, we have a bunch of services, and we can get into much more detail with them, with our solution architects and so on. And your application runs on top of that. So you have advantages to take care of all of these systems to run your application, reducing your work. We want you to spend as little effort worrying about the IT infrastructure below and just focus on the top line, which is your IT infrastructure for your application. I'm going to talk now about a few different usage patterns. And I want to just dive into the actual nuts and bolts of how you pay for Amazon Web Services. Some of you might not be clear on all the different building models and working models we have. So for instance, if you think about a steady state example, we've got the application that's running all the time. We know that over a period of time, that system is going to have a certain need for capacity. So if we put that in, let me jump forward. If we put that in as an amount of hardware that you need over a period of time, it's not going to fluctuate at all. So because you can predict the amount of hardware, you can actually estimate exactly what instance types and instance sizes you require. The second type I'm going to talk about is the spiky predictable. That's when you know exactly when the spikes are coming. Maybe it's coming at the end of the month or at the end of the year. And finally, we'll talk about the worst case, which is everyone's nightmare, is the uncertain, unpredictable case. Now, we have a number of ways of paying for EC2. You've heard a lot of talk about on-demand, and some of the customer panelists actually spoke about reserved instances as well. And I want to describe exactly how that works. So the on-demand is a per-hour basis. You simply pay for the hour that you require it. There's no minimum for the rest of the month, for the rest of the year. You can switch it off anytime you want and stop paying for it. That is literally like your light switch. The second type are these reserved instances. Now, in an example of on-demand where you're paying 2 cents per hour to run the machine, if you buy a reserved instance with a small upfront fee, in this case $23, we will give you a massive discount on the hourly rate for the rest of the year. In fact, we'll drop it down to almost half, 1.2 cents per hour. If you know exactly how many machines you're going to need over a period of time, this is an ideal way to save money. It helps us with capacity planning, and it gives you the reliability of knowing that you're getting the best price. They come in a whole bunch of different flavors. You can use them for 1 year or 3 years. You can tell us if you're going to be using them on a light utilization basis, a medium, or a heavy. So we give you a bunch of different options to optimize the discount that we offer you. So let's play this out in one of those examples, the steady state example. You've got a certain number of machines. Again, in your traditional IT, you have to allocate the maximum amount to make sure that you can cover it. So that's a 6-instance example, right? Let's say we bought reserved instances for all 6 of those. So we're going to give you the maximum discount we possibly can. If you look at the numbers, you'll see that the first column, when an on-premises solution, might cost a certain dollar amount. The second option, we're giving you the absolute best discount because you've helped us by telling us exactly how much capacity you're going to need over the next year or next 3 years. And you'll notice the column on the end there, when you're paying for on-demand, is actually more expensive than paying for it yourself with an on-premises solution. And the reason for that is we're not giving you the very best price we can. And we want to save you as much money as we can. So consider reserved instances in this case where you have a steady state example. That's your best option. Let's play the next example through. You have a spiky predictable load. So you have a certain breakdown of your instances. In this case, we've got 10 machines. 10 machines is what you would need to buy if you were allocating that all for yourself on the IT infrastructure that you're controlling. That's your ownership model. But we would tell you, why don't you buy reserved instances for the first 4? Because you know those are going to run 24/7. And the green part at the top is the variable part. And you only want to pay for those when you need them. And this gets back to my favorite picture, the light switch. You're going to switch them off as soon as you don't require them. So now we look at that back in the table and we say, we can actually equip these machines. You can tell them when to switch off. We have added this capacity or this capability feature into our management console. So for those of you that are already running machines in EC2, go and use this tonight. Go home tonight and switch these systems on. And basically what it's saying is when the CPU gets below a certain threshold, in this case I might say 15%, and it keeps below 15% for 15 minutes, I want you to take an action. Now what is that action? I want you just to stop the instance. Just switch it off. It's as simple as that. If I walk away from the machine, think about a laptop. I walk away from the laptop. If it's quiet for 15 minutes, it shuts itself down. Why shouldn't your instances in EC2 do exactly the same thing? So you can instruct it to stop the instance, and when you need it again, you can go back and switch it on again. But all the time that you're not using it, if you leave it alone on Friday night, it's going to be quiet for the whole weekend. You don't have to pay for it. And that's a big benefit. So let's look at that in the numbers. Again, the on-premises solution on the left, that's what you're traditionally going to have to pay for. But if you look at the three models, you'll see that the absolute best deal is a combination of reserved instances and on-demand. Again, the 4 machines on the bottom is what you're going to buy reserved instances for. You know that systems are coming. And everything on top of it, you're going to pay an on-demand hourly price, but you're only going to pay for it in a little bit amount of time when you actually need it. Now, if you would, again, buy all on-demand instances, you're not going to get the best deal. So we encourage you to think about that and actually split your load between reserved instances and on-demand. All right, final use case. You think you've released this amazing product, and you're hoping that it's going to grow like crazy. That's the dotted line. That's the growth that you're expecting. But in reality, what happens is not quite as successful. So if you had to rush out and buy a whole bunch of reserved instances, you might not be getting the best deal in the long run. And let me show you why. When the example of having your own infrastructure comes in, and you realize that, wow, this system was not as successful as I hoped it would be, you've paid a whole bunch of money for hardware in your own premises that you can't get rid of. If it's in the cloud, though, you have the option of giving it back because it's on demand. So when the system is not as successful as you thought it might be, the cost model starts to look like this. And you'll realize that the more on-demand instances you use in that case, because you're not quite sure whether it'll be successful or not, the more on-demand, the better the price is over the long run. Of course, that's what happens if it's not successful, right? And in that case, that's a pity, but we're hoping this is what really happens. It actually exceeds your expectations. If the growth of your application, if the capacity, the number of users, the number of dollars actually goes above your estimate, 2 things can happen. If you purchased your own IT infrastructure, what happens is you suddenly have a requirement for more capacity than you have in your data center. And that's a bad thing to happen because now you're scrambling to call your vendor to say, buy more, pay more, I want to invest more, right? That's a pity because when the growth comes in the cloud, you simply add more capacity. We don't put a limit or a threshold. You don't have to tell us ahead of time how much you think you might need. When you are successful, you simply pay more on demand. So in this case, you might have invested a whole bunch of reserved instances, but good news, when your system increases in capacity, when you need more, you can just buy more on demand as much as you want. And this is a cost you can't afford. If you built an IT infrastructure yourself and you're more successful than you thought you would be, this is a cost that you now incur. So this is a true cost of ownership. So we hope you don't have to invest in something and actually lose the money because you're so successful. So that's on-demand, reserved instances. Now let me tell you about a third option. And this one is really clever. Spot instances. What we've done here is taken a certain amount of our capacity and offered it to you on a bidding market. You can literally tell us how much you want to spend on that instance. And the price actually fluctuates during the day, hour by hour, depending on the demand of people around you. So for instance, if you were to bid 5 cents an hour on a machine, and someone else bids 6 cents an hour, we take it away from the first guy and we give it to the second guy. Now hold on a minute, how's that going to work? If you're taking instances away from someone, you have to be able to sustain an interruption in your workload. So this is not ideal for a production website. But there are a bunch of use cases that can take advantage of these fluctuating prices. If you look at some of these examples, you recognize what they all have in common. All of these use cases don't require absolute guaranteed time for the job to complete. They can be spread out over a bunch of time. So for instance, if you're doing a bunch of video transcoding, we heard one of the gentlemen here talking about that. If you've got a bunch of work that needs to be done, if it gets done by next Monday, that's good. But it doesn't have to be done right now at this hour. So what you can do is allocate a certain amount of money to the spot market, get the instances when the price is right, do the job when it's right, and if you get interrupted on the way, just wait until the price comes down again and do it again. So what this gives rise to is the opportunity for you to very programmatically and decide, very clever, what you want to pay for the instances that you require. And this is a graph that shows a spread of how much our customers are actually bidding on spot instances. The first category, you'll see some customers are bidding below the on-demand price, which is understandable. They're saying, I can always buy it at on-demand, but let me try and get it a little cheaper by bidding a little bit lower. And sometimes they'll get the instance, sometimes they won't. Sometimes the work will get done, sometimes it gets delayed until the price goes down again. But then we found that some customers were bidding at the on-demand price. And the reason they were doing that is they wanted to make sure that they weren't interrupted. The final section is what's really interesting to me. Some customers figured out, why don't I bid above the on-demand price? And we've had customers bidding 200%, 300, even up to 500% of the price of on-demand. Why? Because they want to make sure that no one else outbids them. But they're willing to pay more on occasion for a couple hours every now and then because most of the time the bid price is well below on-demand. So the aggregate benefit, the cost in total, is actually way lower than buying the on-demand instances themselves. So this gives you something to think about there, about what you could be doing. Let me give you a great example of a company that's taking advantage of this. Who's heard of Vimeo? Any of you used it? It's a fantastic video service. Now, you might not have noticed this, but there's actually two types of customers that Vimeo has. There's those that take advantage of the free offering. When you upload a video, they begin to transcode it if the price is right for them. But they often tell you, you know what, maybe you've got to wait an hour or two. The reason they're doing that is they're waiting for the price to go down on the instances. If you are willing to pay them a bit of money, in other words, subscribe to their service, they will immediately do your job because then they're using reserved instances and they're paying the on-demand price. But they're able to split the load between the two. Very, very clever. I've talked a lot about some of the costs here, but I want to focus now more on some of the actual intangibles, the benefits of using AWS's cloud. And one of the topics that comes up very, very often is security. Now, consider this. How many of your companies have invested millions and millions of dollars in research, in security, in infrastructure, in hardware, in physical infrastructure security, in hiring the best people? Very few companies can afford to do that. But Amazon has, because security is absolutely fundamental to us. But what we've done is offered all of that security to all of our customers. So you have the immediate benefit of a premium level security spec for all of our customers. And if you think about some of the customers that have gone through this process of the accreditations and the certifications, these cost a lot of money to achieve. So if you look at companies like Shell, Netflix, Samsung, NASA, these companies have evaluated AWS's security and decided that it is adequate for their needs and they trust us. But you, as a new customer, have access to exactly the same level of security on day one. And that's tremendously empowering. Again, it's a hidden cost that you would have to incur if you had to own your IT infrastructure. But by not owning the IT infrastructure and letting us take care of it, you inherently get these benefits. That's just one of the many intangibles that if you add them all up, you can see why our flywheel works. And Dr. Vogel's talked about this a little bit, about how we continuously improve our services, which attracts more customers, which means we can build more infrastructure, and we get more economies of scale. So a good example of that is the security. By leveraging the economies of scale of the security we have implemented, all of our customers can take advantage of it. And that's what's enabled us to continuously lower the prices. I'll point out one other thing that a lot of you might not have known. The more you use our service, the less we charge you. The rate actually goes down. Many of our services are tiered in a way that when you use more volume, when you use more capacity, when you use more data transfer, the actual rate per gigabyte of storage, of data transfer and so on actually goes down. I love this quote. One of our customers said how good they look in front of their CFOs simply by using AWS. And if you think about 34 price drops over the last 6 years, isn't it great that you can go to your CFO and say, you know what, we made the right decision. We're on AWS and our price just went down. Our bill just went down. So it's really great that you can take advantage of this by not owning your infrastructure. In fact, we've talked about Trusted Advisor a bit, and we'd love to spend more time telling you about it. If you visit the support booth up at the solution desk up top, we'll give you a lot more detail about this. But this is just a tremendous way that we can actually help customers understand what's going on in their infrastructure. We automatically send you out every month a report of how many showers you've left on, right? We all think about the water just rushing out of the shower and no one's in it. We tell you, hey, that machine, no one's using it. It's still left running. Switch it off, save money. We don't want you to be wasting those resources. We also expose a whole bunch of other things. We'll tell you if you've got a security gap open, or if perhaps you've left a system with not a good configuration that we think you should optimize a little bit. So really take advantage of this Trusted Advisor. From day one that you're using AWS, make sure that you refer to this and take our advice to help you lower your costs further. All of this gets back to my repeated message. You can revisit your architecture as often as you like. You can go back and reevaluate what you're doing, change the building blocks, change the sizes, switch things on and off. It's very dynamic. And each time you do that, you can reduce your costs by changing your architecture, by changing your system, by continuously optimizing it. This is a very, very strong, empowering ability that you get when you're in the cloud, when you're in AWS. Now, all these benefits that you've heard Dr. Vogel's talk about and so on, you might still be hearing people talking about private cloud. Well, let me ask you this. Can you get any of these benefits from a private cloud? No, you can't, because the cloud is private. And by private, that means no one else has access to it, so it's only you going to be using it. It is almost impossible for anyone to tell you that their private cloud is getting 100% utilization. And yet, all the resources that you allocate in AWS are always 100% used, because when you don't need them, you switch them off. So you're only going to pay for exactly what you need. And that's why the private cloud doesn't offer any of these benefits. In fact, Forrester has done a huge amount of surveys and research on this, and they've discovered that many companies that are claiming to build their own private clouds are simply not realizing the benefits that true cloud offers them. Remember, getting back to my original 4 points. Is it elastic? Is it on demand? Are you paying only what you use? And does it allow you to focus on your business? Because if you're worrying about setting up self-service portals and how do I do automation and so on, that's not your business. Focus on your customers first. So to summarize, we've got a pay-as-you-go model. We let you pay less with the more you use. We even pay less when you use them smart by using different combinations. Think on-demand, reserved instance, spot. And finally, if you just stay with AWS, our prices have been dropped 34 times in the last 6 years. It's a pretty good trend. If you're still trying to decide if it's a good idea to go into the cloud versus building your own, take a look at our TCO Calculator. This is a really easy UI. You just simply change the slider, choose how many instances you want or how big your database is, and we will give you what we think is an accurate apples-to-apples comparison of the costs between building it yourself on premises and putting it in the cloud. So I encourage you all to go to our economics page. We've got a lot of white papers, a lot of details. There's a cost estimator, there's a calculator. These are all ways that you can evaluate the costs. And if we've actually commissioned an IDC report last year, which looks at some of our biggest customers, and the details are all online. It's amazing what the return on investment that they've achieved. So I hope this gives you an overview of the TCO, the total cost of non-ownership, the offer that we're making using AWS. And more than anything, we just want to give you a good night's sleep. We don't want you to be this guy, right? Don't worry about the IT infrastructure. Let us take the headache. We don't want you passed out because you've spent many, many hours in the early hours of the night trying to figure out how to network and handle capacity loads and so on. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll hand it back to Bikram now. Have a good day. Thank you.